So my name is Greg Wallenius. I'm one of the MPIs of the CAFE Research Coordinating Center, and this is part of our State of the Science series focused on current topics at the intersection of climate and health. It is my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Michael Brauer, who's professor at the School of Population and Public Health at the University of British Columbia, and also a principal research scientist at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, or IHME, at the University of Washington. As part there, he works on the Global Burden of Disease team, where he leads the Environmental, Occupational, and Dietary Risk Factors team. And I'm sure you've seen his name on literally hundreds of publications from the GBD product, many focused on those topics. His research focuses on the linkages between the built environment and human health, and with specific interest in the global health impacts of air pollution, the relationships between multiple exposures mediated by the urban form and population health, and the health impacts of a changing climate. He's advised a number of august organizations, including the World Health Organization, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, the World Heart Foundation, the U.S. National Academies, and many more. His contributions to environmental health have been recognized by a number of career achievement and publication awards. Michael, we are so happy to have you here. Thank you for your time and insights. And for the audience, I encourage you to put your questions in the chat. We'll get to as many of them as we can, and we'll have some times for Q&A at the end as well. Michael, thank you again, and over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg, and really pleased to be with all of you right now and to talk a bit about wildfire smoke. Let me just share here, and we'll see. Hold on a second. There we go. Great. So I think it's very appropriate that we're talking today about wildfire smoke. We're in North America. We're entering into or already in what's become really an annual season, which is wildfire smoke season. And this is just one image. This is actually a picture taken outside of Edmonton, Alberta, a couple summers ago, but I would gather that many of you in the audience have experienced a situation like this. And really interestingly enough, this is not something that we all grew up with. Of course, wildfire smoke has existed for millennia, but that huge populations, in fact, populations of our major metro areas have been exposed repeatedly. In many places, this is really an annual event. That's really a new phenomenon. So what I'd like to cover today is a little bit on the health impacts of wildfire smoke exposure. What do we know? What don't we know? What diseases are affected? What are our estimates of the overall impacts on population health? With a focus on North America, but also give you a bit of a global perspective. Talk also about the expectations for the future under different climate scenarios, and close a bit with some things that we don't know, understanding exactly sort of the dosing, really another new phenomenon that we're going to have to deal with, which is the situation of structural fires, so wildfires really burning neighborhoods or entire communities, as we have seen again this past year in LA. And then close with some information on sort of exposure reduction. How do we actually minimize the health impacts from this kind of exposure? So this is, as I mentioned, really the new normal, that this is something that we are increasingly experiencing, especially throughout North America. This is data on areas burned in the US. And you can see in the top plot there that there has been an increase in area burned. And if you look down at the bottom, just comparing the last 18 years, well, this is 2003 to 2021, but I can tell you that that sort of difference is actually increasing compared to 1980 to 2002. You can see actually also two things. One is an increase in the area burned, and then also the width of that has increased as well. So the fire season or the smoke season as well has also extended over time. This used to be something that was June, July, August, certainly in the Pacific Northwest where I am, it was really historically been a July and August phenomenon. We're now seeing regularly smoke events in April and extending all the way into October. So both the area burn, but also the length of this fire season has increased. Why is that? Well, it's complex. It certainly has to do with historical forest management practices, has to do with population spread, so where are people living, but it also has to do with a changing climate. So what we are seeing are more frequent fires, fires that are larger and harder to suppress, and the fire season is longer as a result of reduced winter rains, snow that's melting earlier, increased temperatures in the spring and summer. And then another phenomenon that's part of a warming climate that many people don't appreciate is actually there's more lightning. And most of our fires today are actually lightning caused. We have been rather successful with human-caused fires. So mostly this is due to lightning, but actually our lightning strikes are increasing more energy in the atmosphere due to a warmer climate. So there's actually more ignition due to lightning as part of a changing climate. This is just another way. This is looking at now emissions from fires. You can see in the gray and in the black, the mean from 2003 to 2023, and then actually the last 2 years have really been unprecedented. So both 2023 especially and 2024. This is from Canada, but you have similar situations in other parts of the world as well. So just another way of showing that we're actually getting much greater fire emissions. Fires are not restricted to one part of the world. They are everywhere. This is just an image of basically satellite detects that from yesterday. So you can see we've got fires, as is very common this time of the year throughout Central America, also in China, Sub-Saharan and Western Africa, and starting to actually see some fires in Canada as well. So this, and you can look at these kinds of images every day of the year, and you'll see fires somewhere throughout the world. These fires lead to smoke, and you can see even today there are parts of the U.S. that are impacted by smoke plume from fires in Canada. But burned area is actually not increasing everywhere. So what I'm showing you here is the burned area trend from 2003 to 2020. Everything in red is where there's been an increase. Everything in blue is where there's been a decrease. These are not all wildfires. So many of these are fires for land clearing. And you can see, for example, a decrease in South America, decreases in Central Africa, decreases in Central Asia, Eastern Europe. But you also can see some locations where we've seen increases, and these are largely wildfires. So the west coast of North America, especially, also Eastern China, in India, and in Australia, for example. So the overall take-home message is that this is very localized, and some places actually the situation has improved, and some places it is worsening. Fire smoke, which is really the focus of what I will cover today, it tends to come in waves. So this is just a time series, a 10-year time series of airborne particulate matter, PM2.5 concentrations in Vancouver, where I am today. And you can see from 2013 to 2016, really an average or levels that sort of hovered between 5 and 10 micrograms per cubic meter. The World Health Organization guideline is 5 micrograms per cubic meter for long-term exposure. And you can see starting in 2017, and this is a wildfire smoke event. It's the latter part of the year. Another one in 2018, 2019, not so much, 2020 again, 2021, 2022, and 2023. So wildfire smoke is very different in the sense that we get a very intense amount of exposure over a relatively short period of time that again tends to be restricted to that fire season. And usually these events last for about a week before a weather system moves in or before a fire may be controlled. That's sort of the typical situation. Wave frequency and intensity is also increasing in some locations. So this is just another way of looking at some air quality data. This is again from where I live in Vancouver, looking over about 20 years now. And these are air quality advisories. So air quality advisories are issued when air quality is extremely poor. What you can see up until about 2017 or so that most of the color, so that both two things. One is that there were no more than about 10 advisories per year. And most of those, the colors of those advisories are sort of those brown colors, which generally tend to be either winter air pollution episodes due to inversions or photochemical smog episodes. What you see from 2017 to 2018 and onward into 2023 is generally many more advisories. So more periods when air quality was extremely poor. And most of the color there is blue. And most of those are actually wildfire events in the summer. So this sort of wave frequency and intensity is increasing again, in some locations. So just a little bit on how I got into this, just a bit of my sort of background and story. I first got involved in this actually in 1997 during a major episode in Southeast Asia. You can see at the time the types of satellite imagery we had available, which was not very highly resolved. There was a smoke event, basically palm oil plantation burning and land clearing in Indonesia that got out of control during an El Nino year and led to about a 3-month-long episode that affected all of Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, so countries in the region. And we had millions or tens of millions of people exposed to extremely high levels of particulate matter and due to this exposure. At the time, there was a belief that perhaps this was not very harmful. This is natural. People have been living with burning smoke for millennia. And perhaps this was not that harmful. Unfortunately, that was not the case. And this is just some data I collected at the time in the General Hospital of Kuala Lumpur. It was really hard to collect data back then in that period. So this is all collected by hand. You can see the number of visits in red for respiratory disease hovering around 200. And then when the air pollution levels picked up, in the blue there, you can see those respiratory visits to hospital tripled or quadrupled. We saw similar phenomena in all the neighboring countries as well. So this was also some of my colleagues who were respiratory pathologists and physiologists also took advantage of what was really at the time sort of an unprecedented event to do some work which really helped us understand actually the biology of what's going on due to this exposure. So what they did was they actually followed some military recruits who were I guess agreeable to have multiple blood draws every week. And you can see during the smoke period, this is a very opportunistic study, so they didn't have pre-smoke measurements. The levels of the band cells, which are inflammatory cells, and originating in the bone marrow, were much higher than sort of post haze or post smog periods. And this really led to, and there's much more detailed work that goes along with this, but led to an understanding that when people are exposed to these high levels of particulate matter, air pollution, it leads to inflammation, not just in the lungs, but inflammation throughout the circulatory system. So inflammation that then circulates systemically and can then affect other tissues, other organ systems, such as the heart. And this is sort of the understanding that we have today on why air pollution affects things like cardiovascular disease, affects things like diabetes, and even affects neurologic disease such as dementia. So that I'll cover some of that in a bit. So again, an unprecedented event, and it also led to sort of the first set of health guidelines for vegetation and fire events that was put together by the World Health Organization, the UN Environment Program, and the World Meteorologic Organization. A few years after that, we saw what was then an unprecedented event where I live in British Columbia. And this is a region that had always experienced fire. So it reflects a growing population at what we would call the wildland-urban interface. So populations that are now quite large, actually living in areas that are surrounded by forests. So fire and smoke was not uncommon in this region, but what was unusual is now you had cities of 100,000 people or so. And what we saw during that event, and this is just comparing weekly, so the visits to, so respiratory physician visits, so visits to, so outpatient visits for respiratory disease each week compared to the 10-year average for that same week, which is shown in the light gray. And you can see on the top panel also the increases in the particulate matter levels due to these fire events. So depending on the week, there was a 50 to about 80% increase in the respiratory physician visits compared to the historical average in that event. And this led to sort of a start, I would say, of research on this topic, both in North America as well as colleagues in Australia. We had put together in 2016 then a review of the literature and sort of what did we know. And it was very clear sort of at that time that there were increased respiratory disease resulting from wildfire smoke exposure, but really acute impacts. So we were focusing on the day of the fire or the day of the smoke episode, several days afterwards. You saw increases in many symptoms, increases in emergency room visits, hospitalization, and increases in death for respiratory disease. Some evidence of increase in respiratory infections, and such as COVID, but also COVID didn't exist at the time, but also pneumonia. The evidence on cardiovascular disease, I would say, was really very mixed. So there was some suggestion, but did not seem to have sort of the same impacts on cardiovascular disease as we have been seeing for sort of urban air pollution. And emerging evidence, so one or two studies on showing links to worsening of diabetes and birth outcomes, so especially impacts on birth weight. There was really no information on whether there were sort of longer-term impacts of these kinds of episodic exposures. Also, interestingly, in 2012, quite a severe smoke event that coincided with a heat event in Moscow, and quite clear sort of interactions between those two exposures. So heat plus smoke was actually worse than the sum of those together. So they acted synergistically. to really cause sort of extreme, again, a kind of extreme event linked to elevated mortality in Moscow. So this is just an example. This is a recent study. This is now from the 2023 episode that affected the Eastern Seaboard as well as the Midwestern US due to fires burning in Canada. So another phenomenon here that you can clearly see is that this fire smoke can travel hundreds of kilometers from the source. So again, fires burning actually in Western and Central Canada, affecting, in this case, emergency department visits um, in New York City. And you can see, depending on the age group, somewhere between a 12 to a 50% increase in emergency department visits for asthma during the smoke event compared to before or after. There's many studies like this, but this is just one example and quite a recent example. These acute respiratory impacts do extend beyond asthma. This is work that Angela Yao has done, looking at, you can clearly see increases for COPD, so chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, also ear infections and lower respiratory infections. So ear infections, this is not the smoke going into your ear. These start out as upper respiratory infections, and it's sort of the interaction between the smoke exposure and the immune response. Basically, smoke exposure weakens the immune response, weakens our ability to clear those infectious agents that are causing the ear infection in the first place. So it's that upper respiratory infection that then spreads to the ears due to a muted immune response. This is just a study that sort of looked at this from a low and middle income country perspective, where pneumonia, so acute respiratory infections like pneumonia, are still a major killer. And in this analysis, looking at children under 5, so this is from 48 low and middle income countries, you can see a relationship between increasing levels of particulate matter, both fire sourced and non-fire sourced. And you can see sort of the elevated, so increased slope at increasing levels of both fire smoke and non-fire smoked exposure. And some suggestion here that the slope is steeper for fire-sourced particulate matter. Also, I would say still small numbers of studies, but increasing evidence that birth weight decreases in response to wildfire smoke exposure. So this is just from a systematic review, and overall about a 20 gram decrease in birth weight, which is not that's not a huge decrease in birth weight, but if you imagine an entire population being exposed, a population of a large metropolitan area, you're really now shifting the whole distribution of birth weight due to the smoke exposure for people who happen to be pregnant during that event. And I'll come back to this in a bit with some other more recent studies. A few years ago, some cardiologist colleagues of mine got in touch with myself and Sarah Henderson, and we put together a review now, just 6 years later from that prior review, on the evidence for cardiovascular disease. And I would say, unfortunately, what we found is that all of the cardiovascular effects that we tend to see for sort of urban air pollution, urban particulate matter air pollution, there's now increasing evidence for that for wildfire smoke exposure. So seeing cardiac arrest, stroke incidents, arrhythmia, emergency department visits, and hospitalizations, and cardiovascular mortality in some events as well. So seems as though all of the sort of impacts that we tend to see for urban air pollution, we're also seeing for wildfire smoke exposure. So what we know about air pollution, in particular matter, air pollution specifically in general, and why it's such an important risk factor for health in general, is that evidence now exists, and this is work that we've done for the global burden of disease in our analyses, that air pollution affects the top 8 global causes of death. So ischemic heart disease, stroke, chronic lung disease, lower respiratory infections, Alzheimer's disease. So this is something that we've really done a lot of work on recently. So a link between air pollution and dementia. Also lung cancer, diabetes, and neonatal disorders such as preterm birth and low birth weight. So if you imagine a large, if almost, in fact, almost the entire population of the world is exposed to particulate matter above the World Health Organization guideline. For that reason, plus the reason that air pollution is linked to the top causes of death, that's why it's actually such a major population health risk. What we know for wildfire smoke specifically, again, unfortunately, is that we're actually seeing most of these same associations. So I've just put a check next to things where I would say there is decent evidence of a link between wildfire smoke and, again, these causes of death. I've left out 2. One is lung cancer, and the other is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And these are, as you can imagine, these are diseases where we tend to think about sort of, let's say, long-term exposure, the analogy, let's say, to smoking, that you may have to smoke for several years, and these diseases develop rather slowly over time. And I would say we just have not really had to think about them in relation to wildfire smoke. So we tend to think about wildfire smoke as something that's been very episodic. I would say the first 25 to 30 years of my life, I don't remember being exposed to wildfire smoke at all. I just was doing a presentation in Portland to a group of third-year undergraduates, and every single one of them had been exposed repeatedly throughout their lifetimes. So again, not the case when I was that age, and this again is sort of a regular phenomenon. So now, unfortunately, we have to think about this as something that may be a long-term or lifelong exposure, and perhaps linked to sort of development of these chronic diseases such as lung cancer and COPD. There's a little bit of evidence, I guess, suggesting that wildfire smoke, even very limited exposures, may be linked to lung cancer development, and we're sort of doing studies right now focusing on that and COPD to try and understand what I would say is something that we just did not have to worry about previously because of the rather limited exposure that most individuals tended to have. Dementia is another one of those diseases that we tend to think of as progressive, needing sort of a long latency period, and really due to really chronic types of exposures. Joan Daisy has led one of the, I would say, the stronger and larger studies focused on wildfire smoke exposure and incident dementia. This is based on data from the Kaiser Health System in California, and she saw in this about a 20% increased risk of new dementia cases related to wildfire smoke exposure. There's also an increased risk for non-wildfire smoke particulate matter exposure, but it's much smaller than the odds ratio for wildfire smoke. So we can talk about why that may be. Obviously, wildfire smoke exposure, that smoke is different than sort of typical urban air pollution from a chemical perspective. I tend to think what's probably more important is actually how we're exposed to it, sort of the dosing. And again, coming back to the fact that we may be exposed to very low levels of air pollution, depending on where we live over the course of a lifetime. But in a wildfire smoke event, certainly where I live, if we get a 3-day episode of smoke, that is 90% of our exposure for the whole year. So it's just sort of an orders of magnitude difference in the level of exposure. And you can then think about that sort of overcoming defense mechanisms, our immune response, for example, and leading to sort of different impacts, let's say, on health. That's a question that we really don't we don't fully have the answer to it at all. So does that sort of dosing matter? But I'll again show you some information that I think is suggesting that in some cases it does. So I would say these kinds of results are really surprising. Again, the fact that something that comes in really episodically, and you're not exposed to every day of the year, every day of your life, can lead to something like dementia. This is really a amazing study, and that my colleague Stephanie Cleland did, which I would say adds some support to this. So what she did was really try and investigate something that actually many people, and certainly I've experienced it, anecdotally, is that when there's a smoke event, there's sort of brain fog. People just don't feel right. So when I kind of go out in the community during a smoke event, I actually don't feel any respiratory symptoms myself. I tend to go on bike rides and I don't feel anything. But what I hear everybody talking about, I hear two words all the time. One is apocalypse. So if you've experienced this, you'll see sort of the orange sky. Things really don't feel right. And people tend to also seem confused. And there's just something that you feel that is just not right, your ability to make decisions. And Stephanie sort of wanted to investigate this phenomenon. So they got hold of data from Luminosity, which is an online brain training game. So it's one of those games that you sort of use to, I guess, keep yourself sharp. It's something that especially many adults, middle-aged and older adults, tend to play. So you can play this game online daily. And she looked at the scoring about, I think this is about 10,000 adults in the US, and basically looked at their scores on days when they were exposed to wildfire smoke compared to days that they were not exposed to wildfire smoke. She adjusted for sort of training, how often they played the game, etc. And what you can see is within sort of 3 hours of exposure, but sort of extending certainly throughout the day of exposure. And there's some suggestion perhaps of kind of a lagged effect that things might accumulate even over a week. But basically those scores decreased decreased in relation to wildfire smoke exposure. You also can see that in the throughout the U.S. There was a decrease, but in the Western U.S., where a greater proportion of the particulate matter is from wildfire smoke exposure, so the background from other sources is lower, there was again even a greater decrease. So this is suggesting that basically people's cognitive function on a short-term basis is compromised as a result of that smoke exposure. So now linking this to something like dementia, and we've certainly discussed this with our neurologist colleagues, There is the potential that these sort of repeated short-term impacts, and I would say this kind of impact is fully reversible. But these repeated impacts can lead to basically some kind of restructuring, a remodeling of brain networks that may lead to sort of longer-term cognitive deficits that may contribute to dementia. So we're now starting to study this sort of mechanistically, really try and with functional MRI and really try and understand exactly what's going on due to this kind of exposure. I'll also point out that, and this is work that one of my former students, Angela Yao, did, that the impacts of, like we saw with that luminosity training, these impacts tend to be observed in general within hours of exposure. And this matters because if you've ever been in a wildfire smoke event, conditions can change really rapidly from hour to hour, depending on how close you are to the fire and wind direction. So it's unlike a typical sort of urban air pollution event where the emissions tend to really be sort of constant, and what actually leads to high or low levels of air pollution tends to be weather conditions that will, let's say, affect a whole metropolitan area or a whole airshed, depending on where you are. So you may get a high pressure system, you may get an inversion that is really capping in those emissions, and let's say a whole city is affected. For wildfire smoke exposure, depending on where the source is, you think about the angle of wind speed. You can get dramatic changes from hour to hour, and what Angela was interested in and what we try to study is actually how much exposure do you have to have and how quickly does it result in impact. So she looked at ambulance call data. Basically, and for an ambulance call, we know exactly the location where the call is to, we know the exact timing, and basically saw this relationship that within 1 hour of exposure, there was an increased ambulance dispatches for respiratory and cardiovascular causes, as well as complications of diabetes. So all this to say is that these impacts can occur very, very rapidly. So what does all this mean, sort of putting together? This was back in 2012, work led by my colleague in Australia, Faye Johnston. We did an analysis based on our understanding at the time to try and estimate global mortality attributable to wildfire smoke exposure. We estimated that based on sort of 10 years of data, about 340,000 deaths each year. You can also see that we looked at an El Nino year and a La Nina year, and there's about a factor of 2 difference between those years. So again, this is a very common phenomenon with wildfire smoke. Not every year is bad. Not every location is bad all the time, so you can get a lot of variability. So that's sort of one of these kinds of analysis. We did another one where we were actually trying to model sort of all different sources, and then this is again for 2019, so a different year. We estimated about 140,000 deaths in 2019. This is an analysis done in Canada, and again, about a factor of 5 difference between, let's say, a lower fire smoke year compared to a worse wildfire smoke year. Also that in this analysis looked at the deaths due to long-term exposure. So basically due to elevation, let's say, of long-term average exposure or exposure over the whole year versus sort of acute impacts. Those chronic exposure impacts are about 10-fold more hazardous than the acute exposures. So again, suggesting the need to really pay attention to wildfire smoke as a contributor to long-term exposure. But again, pointing out that there's a lot of variability from year to year. And then this is a recent analysis done for the US. suggesting this is an average over, I think, about a 10-year period, around 11,000 deaths per year. What you can see are the about half of those are from cardiovascular disease, but interestingly enough, about 20% or so from things like dementia, as well as suicide. And there's a growing literature actually on suicide during and shortly after smoke events, especially in rural populations. So the idea that perhaps rural populations are at higher risk of suicide for other causes, and an acute event such as a wildfire smoke event sort of pushes people, let's say, over the edge to where they will attempt suicide. So again, sort of emerging kinds of work now. So I mentioned this sort of, link with chronic diseases, or let's say longer term effects of these acute episodes. And this is, I would say, one of the first studies to really look at this, done by Curtis Noonan and his colleagues in Montana. And what they showed, I was really interesting, is that if individuals were exposed to wildfire smoke in the summer, that led to an increased risk for flu in the following winter. So again, think about this. So summer exposure to smoke sets you up for increased risk of flu the following winter. So it fits with our understanding of how air pollution affects immune responses, in the sense where those things are really coinciding quite closely in time. But now it seems as though that air pollution response actually extends for months afterwards into the following season. So again, if this kind of phenomenon is sort of replicated, I think it really changes our understanding of the importance and the impact of smoke. It's not actually just what's happening during that exposure, but what it actually does for the next year, and perhaps even throughout the life course. Another example, so this is work that one of our students, Janet Lan, did, and she looked at exposure during pregnancy and the relationship between that and respiratory infections in the first year of life and antibiotic use in those kids due to those respiratory infections. What you can see here, if you just look at the right panel, is that if there was exposure during pregnancy, at any point during pregnancy, so either the first, second, or third trimester, there was an increased risk of otitis media or an ear infection the following, so after birth in the first year of life, and coinciding with that, an increased risk of antibiotic dispensation, which is very common. So it's the most common cause of antibiotic prescription in young children are ear infections. What you can also see, though, is that if exposure occurred during the second trimester, the odds ratio for subsequently developing an ear infection and needing antibiotics was actually much higher than if exposure occurred during the first or the third trimester. So suggesting that there's critical, especially during pregnancy, critical windows of exposure when that smoke really matters more than at other times of the year or other times in the life. And this is really what we're trying to understand now. So are there periods when we really need to be careful? So like the second trimester of pregnancy, but you can think about certain sensitive ages of development of young children, or with aging adults, periods in the life course when that smoke exposure, again, that very acute exposure, may be sort of more important than at other times in life. And again, that's a question that we don't know the answer to and are really trying to address right now. So as I kind of try and wind things down a bit, talk a little bit about what we expect with climate change. I would say, again, this is very localized and not consistent throughout the world. There are locations where, not necessarily with a warming climate, but with action that is taken to address climate change, wildfire smoke will improve. In North America, the suggestions are that we've already actually done some of those actions, and that the warmer climate will worsen the level of wildfire smoke exposure, but also its relative contribution to air pollution. So what you can see in this study is the gray is the non-fire particulate matter, and depending on the future climate scenario from 2000 to 2100, that gray is decreasing. Overall, actually, levels of particulate matter exposure are expected to decrease in North America, but the red will increase. So that's the wildfire smoke particulate matter, and also the relative importance, the relative magnitude. So now it may contribute 10 to 15% in the US. Depending on the scenario, it could be as high as 50% of the air pollution in the US. And again, projected to perhaps, depending on the scenario, go from double in the mortality or even sort of triple in the future. So what can we do about this? So I think it's very clear that this is unlike sort of traditional air pollution, where we can completely control the source. So we have been very successful in controlling the sources of emissions from general air pollution, whether that's motor vehicle exhaust, power generation, industrial emissions. We can do some through forest management to reduce smoke, but quite clearly that we are going to be dealing with smoke, and we can't fully do this with source control. So we actually need to reduce exposure to smoke that will be with us for our lifetimes. I would say in general, there's sort of two different kind of approaches that both need to happen. Probably the most important and the one that's most neglected is pre-season preparation. Whether that's for an individual, meaning that if you have a disease that may lead you to increased sensitivity to wildfire smoke exposure. Is your disease well managed? And do you have sufficient medication on hand? And one of the things we see, especially in smaller communities, is that if there is a smoke event, local pharmacies will actually run out of prescriptions. So they'll run out of inhalers, for example, or run out of nitroglycerin. So making sure that you actually have the medication on hand, but also making sure that your disease is as well managed as possible. And overall, the better level of health that an individual has, the less likely they will be affected by wildfire smoke. Also, pre-season preparation refers to outdoor events, and this is sort of increasingly something that I'm getting questions about all the time. If it's a triathlon, a concert, a wedding, do you have a plan for what happens if there's a smoke event? What are you going to do? When are you going to decide to cancel? If you don't cancel, how are you going to protect that population? And it's increasingly something that I would say for outdoor events as well as sports in general. So sports that are taking place outdoors during summer are having to deal with, and I think we're going to see more attention on that. We also have now, I would say, quite good forecasting for episodes 48 to 72 hours in advance throughout North America. We've done, I'll show you later, actually, if I can find the slide here, I'll come back to it. We've actually shown the effectiveness of those forecasts. And then there's a whole bunch of interventions that individuals can take to reduce their exposure. One that's very common, and this is an old study we did almost 20 years ago, looking at just using room air cleaners, HEPA filter air cleaners. We see about a 65% decrease in indoor fire smoke exposure when an air cleaner is used indoors. Again, just showing sort of a time series here. There's lots of guidance on air cleaners, how to buy the appropriate one. My general advice is sort of as long as it's HEPA, simpler is better. Make sure the unit is sized appropriately for the room. These are not incredibly expensive, but if individuals can't afford them, there's also a wealth of material on how do you build do-it-yourself air cleaners. And we have in my area, we actually have community gatherings to build air cleaners. So you can do it with instruction as part of a group. And this is something that especially we've seen in smaller communities. So I mentioned smoke forecasts. Again, we have these throughout North America, and they're increasingly sort of integrated into, I see them on TV weather forecasts during smoke periods, and there's work to try and extend them for longer periods. This is again a study that we did more than 10 years ago, basically showing that those smoke forecasts predict health impacts. So obviously those forecasts aren't perfect forecasts of reality, but they do predict health responses. And so basically the error in the forecast are not so high that they're unuseful. Again, evidence that they're really useful. So again, a lot of information on sort of preparation, both at the individual level, health system, and community level that I would say is underway, but we need a lot more. And this is to be expected that the locations that have experienced smoke events repeatedly, such as the Pacific Northwest, I would say are more advanced. When that smoke episode affected the Eastern Seaboard and New York City, in general, I would say communities and health systems were not at all prepared. And that makes sense. That was probably the first major event. What actually wasn't the first major event, but that they'd experienced, but wasn't a regular thing. And again, unfortunately, I think this is something that many more communities throughout North America are going to have to deal with. We also should be thinking about, again, this long-term thing. And I would say, how do we approach summer? Do we think about in areas with high smoke probability that may be discouraging summer tourism? So in my region, everybody I know has had a vacation canceled, or that they've had to alter their vacation plans due to smoke exposure. Do we actually think about promoting tourism more in the shoulder seasons? Or what about summer sporting events? Do we think about, again, maybe thinking about them more in the shoulder seasons rather than during the traditional summer, which is when we tend to get more smoke exposure? And then finally, something that, again, used to be, I would say, rather unusual, which are these structural fires. So when we're getting fires, burning structures, burning entire communities or neighborhoods, as we saw in LA, we're now burning car batteries containing lead, burning all of our household furnishings, all of the plastics, what is happening. And so there's emerging evidence of the kinds of exposures that are experienced, not just during the event, but also during cleanup and during re-entry, and then also to neighboring households that have probably been evacuated during the fire itself, but are when their structure is standing. So we had situations in LA where you may be living across the street from a neighborhood that was completely burned. Your house is actually fine. You come back into it after evacuation, and now you've got a layer of soot, and there's almost no guidance for individuals on what to do. How do you clean that? What kind of personal protective equipment do you wear during that kind of event? What kinds of things are you being exposed to? And really just sort of emerging evidence. So I think I'll close there, and I know I'm ran late, so if there's time, I can take as many questions as people want to stick around for. So thanks very much.
Fantastic job. Thank you, Mike. Big round of applause from the audience. I'm sure that was just such a terrific overview and such a compelling story. It's not just sort of that this is bad, but this is bad and getting worse, and also thinking about how individuals and communities can adapt. So really the full package. Mike, I'll start us off with one question and then invite again the audience to put their questions in the chat, and we'll let Michael get to as many of them as time permits. But so as you know, for decades, we've sort of understood that by location, the contributions of, say, PM 2.5 or air pollution more broadly from different sources, we can understand that in some areas of the country, it was historically coal-fired power plants that were associated with the greatest burden of disease, and in other places it might have been traffic, et cetera. Have those estimates been redone to, in the light of sort of new wildfire smoke levels, like in your neck of the woods, like is traffic even important as a source anymore, or is it really, so overwhelmed now by the health impacts of wildfire smoke?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on where you are. And again, so in my region, absolutely. So in fact, the two biggest sources that we have in my region are still our fireplaces. So you think about all the technology improvements that we've seen in motor vehicles.
Mhm.
Um, we haven't done that for fireplaces, and we still have tens of thousands of fireplaces. So that's a major source, and then the other one is wildfire smoke. So it's sort of we've been successful, right, with those traditional sources. That's good. That's really good news. And in the one case, so fireplaces is something that we just haven't really addressed. So they haven't gotten worse, but the greater proportion a contribution. But wildfire smoke is something that has gotten worse again in certain locations. So I would say two conclusions from that. One is that because it's much more difficult to control exposure to wildfire smoke, we can't really reduce the source. That means we still need to, pay attention to those other sources that we can control. The more that we can reduce those, the better. But the other thing is obviously to think about this as a different kind of exposure, and how do we address it? And it's something where, unfortunately, because we can't deal with a source, we do have to think about exposure reduction. So I never would have recommended that individuals wear masks 24/7 to reduce air pollution exposure. I mean, I think that would be a sign of defeat to say that, this is our approach. Everybody has to wear a mask. But for wildfire smoke exposure, because we can't reduce the source, and we know that that's effective, and we also know from the pandemic that we can have sufficient supplies of masks, and we know how to do that. That can be effective. If you go back to that situation I had 20 years ago in Southeast Asia, that episode depleted the entire mask supply of the world at that time. You could not get any masks, so there were millions of people who wanted them and could not get them. We now know how to address that.
That's terrific. Thank you. Let me elevate a question by Kate Adams, who asks, are there differences between acute impacts due to fresh smoke from nearby fires versus the health impacts of longer range transported smoke, aged smoke? So specifically in the context of Massachusetts, we get a lot of long range transport of wildfire smoke, often locally blamed on the Canadian wildfires, but we also get some local smoke. Do we know enough about whether there's differences in health impacts of those?
Yeah, I would say unfortunately not. The only thing that we can say is if you're very close to the fire, and again, this is something people have probably experienced, let's say over a campfire, there's gaseous irritants, so especially aldehydes. So what makes your eyes water, what may make you cough if you're, get a blast of campfire smoke. Those gases tend to, not persist. They're actually converted into particles. They don't tend to persist, but that's really just very close to the fire itself. And we really don't have that information, about sort of transported from short distances over long distances. Certainly all of the ash also falls out, again, very close to the fire. So you're left with the, very, very small particles, the ones that can infiltrate indoors. But yeah, not much information, unfortunately.
Okay, great. Sashir Dahal asks, in regions where hospitals or clinical data are scarce, what alternative methods can be used to assess the short-term health impacts of wildfire smoke? And I guess part of the question is, do we need to assess locally the impacts, or are the impacts sort of generalizable from the existing literature? I know that's a controversial question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in British Columbia, so Sarah Henderson and her colleagues, they actually routinely do surveillance for prescription dispensation, so for salbutamol, so inhalers and nitroglycerin. So you don't need big numbers for that, and they can see this in sort of in small communities, that kind of information. Yeah, I don't think for those sort of things we actually need more evidence. I think certainly these kind of acute effects are quite clear. And we have yet to see, I would say, for air pollution in general and for wildfire smoke as well, that there are really dramatic differences between populations. So air pollution seems to affect people, period.
Yeah. Yeah, well, one of my friends and colleagues, David Savitz, a few years ago wrote a commentary that more research may not be needed. We all end our papers with more research is needed. And he says sometimes we actually don't. In that case, it was the example of lead in drinking water. We know it's bad. We don't really need a lot more studies showing that it's bad. What we need to do is spend the time remediating to reduce exposures. But it's a very controversial point. Um, Nina Renshaw asks, what's your hypothesis about which components of PM 2.5 can be linked to specific health outcomes? And I would add to that, does it matter?
Yeah, so obviously it's sort of still an area of active research. And again, this is really my bias. I tend to think that sort of the chemistry is so complex that so smoke from wildfires is chemically very different than smoke from vehicle exhaust or power plant emissions. Um, but both of them seem to be hazardous. Um, they do share some commonalities. I tend to think what's actually more different between those two is that dosing. And so that's really what I'm actually paying attention to more than the chemical composition. And then also, I'm not sure what we'll do if we understand the chemical composition. We can't, what does that mean? We're not gonna deal with the source of trees or something, like the chemistry is the chemistry. I mean, it's sort of interesting, from a scientific or mechanistic perspective. But basically, whether it comes from power plants or wildfire smoke, it seems to be hazardous. But there is this big difference in the dosing, and I think that really needs to be understood. It's sort of I would say, a rather simple question that we should know the answer to, and then we don't. Does it matter? How much does it matter, and for what? So that's really what I'm sort of focusing on.
All right, great. And I think I'll close with Elena McIntyre asks, how would you respond to the decision maker asking if wildfire pollution is more toxic or harmful than other sources of air pollution, including traffic-related air pollution or industry? And you spoke about this a little bit and showed some data. It seems that, well, I'll let you comment on sort of whether that's settled about the relative toxicity of wildfire smoke PM versus other sources.
Yeah, so I would respond, and I have responded this way, that there's no evidence that it's less toxic.
Mhm.
The evidence is that is at least as toxic. And again, I think we need to pay attention to this sort of dosing, and some suggestions that because of that sort of difference in dosing, it could be more harmful. And so for example, I give much stronger advice to pregnant people about wildfire smoke exposure than I do about air pollution in general. and really say, this is something you need to avoid, because you can get, a year's exposure during 5 days of your pregnancy. Um, so it's then like, for those 5 days, you're moving to Delhi. Um, would I tell you to move to Delhi during a pregnancy? No. But that's exactly sort of what you're getting, and it may be even worse because it could be, even higher for a shorter period of time. And so I can give that advice now for a pregnant person. What I want to understand is, who else do I need to give that advice to? And maybe, maybe nobody else. But that's really what we, I think, need to understand.
All right. Wonderful. Professor Michael Brauer, thank you so much for your time, your insights, and a fantastic presentation. As Elaine has put in the chat, we will be archiving this recording along with our other ones on the Cafe YouTube channel. Elaine, maybe you can put that link in there again. Thank you to Elaine and her team for organizing this series. Please stay tuned for more on this series and other cafe events. We're here for you. So if you have ideas on what you'd like to hear, please email Elaine and her team. We'd do our best to accommodate requests. And with that, I will close. Again, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.